The most dangerous moment for a narcissist isn't when the empath is crying, it's when he goes quiet. Because when an empath finally gets angry, he doesn't explode. He calculates. And that shift changes everything. If you've ever reached that moment where you didn't yell, you just stopped, comment, I went quiet. I want to see how many of you know exactly what this shift feels like. The biggest misunderstanding about an empath is the belief that kindness is their permanent personality rather than a conscious choice. People assume that because someone is emotionally attuned, compassionate, and patient, they are incapable of sharpness, distance, or even severity. That myth is dangerous. Empathy does not mean weakness, it means awareness. And awareness includes awareness of harm. An empath often spends years being described as too nice, too understanding, or the bigger person. In relationships with narcissistic personalities, this myth becomes a trap. The empath believes their role is to regulate the chaos, soothe the storms, and translate dysfunction into something manageable. They excuse disrespect because they can see the wound behind it. They tolerate manipulation because they can see the insecurity driving it. They stay longer because they understand more. But understanding someone's pain does not erase the impact of their behavior. The myth of the always kind empath pressures them into suppressing anger. They tell themselves that reacting would make them just as bad. They fear becoming cruel, so they swallow resentment. They intellectualize mistreatment instead of confronting it. Over time, this creates an internal split. On the outside, they remain composed and generous. On the inside, a quiet ledger is forming. Every dismissal, every gaslight, every moment of emotional extraction. When the breaking point comes, observers are shocked. This isn't like you, they say, but it has always been there. The difference is that the empath has stopped prioritizing harmony over self-respect. What looks like cruelty is often the removal of cushioning. The empath stops softening the truth, stops padding feedback, stops absorbing blame to keep peace. The same emotional intelligence that once made them accommodating now makes them exact. They know precisely where the manipulation lives because they felt it in real time. When they finally respond from anger rather than accommodation, their words are not chaotic. They are accurate, and accuracy delivered without warmth feels ruthless to someone who relied on their softness. Suppressed anger in an empath doesn't disappear just because it isn't expressed. It accumulates. And because empaths are highly attuned to emotional environments, they often prioritize stability over confrontation. When a narcissistic personality creates tension, blame shifts, or rewrites reality, the empath instinctively moves to de-escalate. They calm, they rationalize, they try to understand. What they rarely do is release their own anger in real time. Instead, they store it. Each invalidating comment gets tucked away. Each broken promise is mentally cataloged. Each moment of being talked over, dismissed, or subtly belittled leaves a mark. But because the empath fears being too much, they override their natural anger response. They tell themselves they're overreacting. They convince themselves the other person didn't mean it. They translate disrespect into misunderstanding. This is emotional overload in slow motion. The nervous system of an empath in a narcissistic dynamic is constantly working. Hypervigilance becomes normal. They scan tone, facial expressions, micro-shifts in mood. They anticipate eruptions. They rehearse conversations in their head to avoid triggering defensiveness. All of that effort creates internal pressure, And because they're not exploding outwardly, people assume they're unaffected. They're not unaffected, they're saturated. Suppressed anger doesn't stay quiet forever. It transforms. It becomes irritability over small things. It becomes emotional fatigue. It becomes detachment. The empath may not even realize how much resentment has built up until something minor triggers a disproportionate reaction. That reaction isn't about the small event. It's about the 100 previous moments that were never processed. When overload peaks, the empath doesn't always scream. Often they shut down. Their warmth cools. Their patience shortens. Their tolerance evaporates. To the narcissist, this feels sudden and confusing. "Why are you so angry?" they ask, as if the anger appeared out of nowhere. But it didn't appear. It was compressed. And when compressed anger finally releases, it doesn't come out messy. It comes out firm, controlled, final. The breaking point for an empath rarely comes from one dramatic incident. It comes from repetition, from patterns that can no longer be explained away. A narcissistic dynamic thrives on cycles: idealize, devalue, confuse, reset. And in the beginning, the empath clings to the idealization. They hold onto the version of the narcissist that felt attentive, connected, almost magical. So when the devaluation begins, the criticism, the withdrawal, the subtle contempt, the empath searches for ways to restore harmony. They try harder. They communicate more clearly. They become more patient. They assume responsibility for tensions they didn't create. Each time the narcissist manipulates, deflects, or gaslights, the empath absorbs it as something to solve rather than something to confront. But repetition changes perception. After enough cycles, the empath stops seeing isolated incidents and starts seeing structure. The apologies begin to sound scripted. The affection feels conditional. The arguments follow the same choreography. It's no longer confusing, it's predictable. And predictability destroys hope. The breaking point happens the moment clarity overrides attachment. It's the instant the empath realizes they have been negotiating for basic respect. It's recognizing that no matter how gently they speak, how clearly they explain, how deeply they empathize, the outcome doesn't shift. The narcissist may adjust tactics, but the power imbalance remains. That realization is sobering. It strips away the fantasy that love can heal dysfunction. It exposes the emotional labor imbalance. It forces the empath to confront an uncomfortable truth. They are not in a partnership. They are in a system where their empathy is being harvested. When that truth lands, something inside them hardens, not into bitterness, but into resolve. The emotional door doesn't slam dramatically. It closes quietly. The empath stops arguing for understanding, stops chasing repair, stops volunteering emotional reassurance. And to the narcissist, this shift feels abrupt, but to the empath, it feels overdue. Strategic silence is one of the most misunderstood shifts an empath makes after enduring narcissistic dynamics. People assume silence means weakness, avoidance, or emotional shutdown. In reality, for an empath who has reached clarity, silence becomes deliberate. It becomes power reclaimed. In a narcissistic dynamic, words are constantly weaponized. Conversations are twisted. Confessions are stored for later use. Vulnerabilities are turned into accusations. The empath learns, often painfully, that explaining more does not create understanding. It creates ammunition. So eventually, they stop supplying it. This is not passive aggression. It is discernment. The empath begins to recognize that not every accusation deserves a rebuttal. Not every provocation requires a defense. Not every emotional performance deserves an audience. Where they once rushed to clarify misunderstandings, they now allow distortions to sit unchallenged because they understand something critical. The narcissist isn't confused. They are controlling. Silence disrupts that control. A narcissistic personality feeds on reaction, whether it's anger, tears, pleading, or over-explaining. Reaction confirms influence. But when the empath responds with minimal words, neutral tone, or no response at all, the dynamic destabilizes. There's no emotional fuel, no dramatic escalation, no evidence of being rattled. Withdrawal follows naturally. The empath reduces availability. They stop volunteering emotional labor. They limit access to personal thoughts and future plans. Communication becomes logistical rather than intimate. The warmth that once flowed freely is now guarded. To the narcissist, this feels like cruelty. You've changed, they may say, and they're right. The empath has changed, but not into something harsher, into something wiser. Strategic silence is the empath refusing to participate in circular arguments. Withdrawal is the empath refusing to audition for respect. It's the quiet understanding that engagement is optional. And when an empath learns that their attention is a privilege, not an obligation, their silence becomes louder than any confrontation. For a long time, guilt is the leash that keeps the empath in place. Even when mistreated, even when drained, even when deeply hurt, they question themselves first. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I should have handled that better. This reflex to self-interrogate keeps the narcissistic dynamic intact because the empath is always willing to adjust before demanding accountability. But clarity changes that internal script. The shift from guilt to clarity doesn't happen overnight. It happens in quiet realizations. The empath starts replaying conversations and noticing patterns instead of isolated incidents. They see how often they apologize just to restore peace. They recognize how frequently their needs were labeled dramatic, inconvenient, or selfish. They begin to understand that the discomfort they felt wasn't hypersensitivity, it was misalignment and disrespect. Clarity reorganizes memory. Moments that once felt confusing suddenly make sense. The love bombing wasn't deep connection, it was fast attachment. The silent treatments weren't about space, they were about control. The constant criticism wasn't honesty, it was erosion. When the empath sees the structure of the dynamic, guilt loses its grip. Instead of asking, "What did I do wrong?" they begin asking, "Why did I accept that?" That question is powerful. It moves the focus inward, but not in a self-blaming way. It becomes about self-respect. The empath realizes that empathy without boundaries became self-betrayal. They weren't wrong for being kind. They were wrong for tolerating harm in the name of kindness. As clarity strengthens, the need to justify fades. The empath no longer feels compelled to defend their boundaries with emotional essays. They don't over-explain their decisions. They don't seek permission to step back. The guilt that once softened every stance is replaced with steadiness. And when an empath operates from clarity instead of guilt, their presence changes. They are less reactive, less apologetic, less available for manipulation. They don't need the narcissist to understand their boundaries, they only need to enforce them. When an empath reaches the point of weaponized truth, it isn't about cruelty, it's about precision. For a long time, they softened everything. They edited their observations. They diluted their insights to avoid wounding someone who seemed fragile or reactive. They saw the inconsistencies, the subtle lies, the shifting narratives, but they packaged their awareness gently, hoping to be heard without triggering escalation. Eventually, they stop cushioning. An empath is often highly perceptive. They notice tone shifts, micro expressions, contradictions between words and actions. In a narcissistic dynamic, they may stay quiet about these observations because calling them out leads to denial, rage, or blame shifting. So they gather data silently, pattern after pattern, proof after proof. When anger finally aligns with clarity, that stored perception becomes direct language. The empath no longer says, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like. They say, you said this on Monday and the opposite on Thursday. They no longer debate feelings, they cite behavior. They no longer plead for understanding, they describe patterns, and they do it calmly. That calm delivery is what feels ruthless. There's no screaming, no dramatic meltdown, just accuracy without warmth. The narcissist, who once relied on emotional chaos to derail conversations, suddenly has to face specifics. Gaslighting becomes harder when the empath isn't doubting their memory. Deflection becomes weaker when the empath refuses to chase it. Boundary enforcement follows naturally. The empath doesn't threaten consequences, they implement them. If disrespect continues, access decreases. If manipulation appears, engagement stops. If promises break, trust is withdrawn. Not loudly, not theatrically, just consistently. To someone accustomed to endless chances, this feels harsh. The narcissist may accuse the empath of being cold, unforgiving, even cruel. But what's actually happening is accountability without cushioning. Weaponized truth isn't about attacking vulnerabilities. It's about refusing distortion. It's the empath deciding that protecting the other person's ego is no longer more important than protecting their own reality. And once that line is drawn, it is rarely erased. What people label as cruelty in an empath is often the first visible sign of self-protection. When an empath finally withdraws warmth, limits access, or refuses emotional labor, it can look sharp compared to their former softness. The contrast is what shocks people, but contrast is not the same as malice. For a long time, the empath operated from outward flowing compassion. They absorbed tension. They gave second chances. They translated harsh behavior into hidden pain. In doing so, they overextended themselves. Their empathy became porous. Everything got in. Criticism, projection, blame. Over time, this eroded their sense of safety. Self-protection begins the moment they realize that unlimited understanding does not create mutual respect. Instead of asking, how can I fix this? They begin asking, is this safe for me? That subtle pivot changes behavior dramatically. The empath who once stayed late to resolve conflict now ends the conversation when it turns circular. The empath who once explained their feelings in paragraphs now offers a sentence. The empath who once gave access to every vulnerability now shares selectively. To someone who benefited from their openness, this feels like punishment. But the empath is not trying to wound. They are trying to stabilize. They are learning that boundaries are not acts of aggression. They are acts of preservation. When they say no without smiling, when they decline without softening the refusal, when they detach without theatrics, it may feel cold to the other person, yet internally it feels like relief. There is grief in this stage. The empath may mourn the version of themselves who believed love could outwork dysfunction. They may question whether they've become hardened, But what's actually happening is integration. Empathy is no longer being used against them. Cruelty seeks to cause pain. Self-protection seeks to prevent it. And when an empath chooses self-protection, the only thing being cut off is access to their unguarded heart.